"I'm not clean," she whispered. What kind of pain forces a woman to believe she is nothing but the scars others branded into her? How many nights did she cover her face praying no one would ever see the truth beneath the cloth? And yet, what if in the silence of a lonely cabin, one rancher looked at her scars and saw beauty, dignity, and a future instead? Would love, true, tender love, finally be waiting for her in the very place she feared the most? The train screeched to a halt at Sagebrush Bend, a town barely big enough for its own name. Dust swirled through the platform, clinging to skirts, boots, and the edges of the prairie wind. Clara stepped down slowly, her hand gripping the worn handle of her carpetbag. She moved as if each step weighed more than her 50 years. A faded cloth was wrapped around her head, and neck pulled high enough to shadow her face. She adjusted it constantly as though without it, she might unravel entirely. To most eyes, it was a simple kerchief against dust. But to her, it was armor, the only shield she had against stares that could cut sharper than knives. She had not been sent with flowers or smiles. No one called her name. No hand reached out. She came because she had nowhere else. Her family had pressed her into leaving not out of kindness but convenience, calling her a burden. Too heavy a mouth, too many. They told her in whispers, meant to pierce, that she was not clean, that her scars, both seen and unseen, were marks of shame. Now she stood alone waiting. The town moved around her like a stream that bends around a rock without touching. Men led their horses past without lifting their hats. Women drew children closer. Still, Clara straightened her back, her quiet dignity like a candle refusing to go out in the wind. At the edge of the platform she saw him. Thomas, a rancher broad of shoulder, his hair salted, by time his eyes steady like the land itself. He hadn't come for spectacle. He hadn't even meant to pause. But something in the way Clara stood, cloth, wrapped eyes lowered, but not broken, caught him still. He stepped forward. "You the one looking for work?" His voice was low, almost hesitant. Clara nodded, fingers tightening around her carpetbag. "You cook," she swallowed. "I can. I don't talk much, mister." Her voice carried the rasp of someone who had been silenced too long. He studied her not with suspicion, but with the quiet patience of a man used to waiting for calves to stand on wobbly legs or for spring rain to come when the earth cracked dry. Then he said the simplest words she'd heard in years. "You're coming with me." Something inside her flinched, remembering how those same words had once meant chains, not freedom. Yet his tone was not commanding. It was offering, as if he were saying, "You don't have to stand here alone anymore." That night in the small cabin at Cotton Willow Ranch, Clara sat by the fire, her hands busy, with mending, her heart heavy. She feared the moment the cloth might slip, the moment truth might be seen. And so when Thomas laid out bandages and a bottle of antiseptic on the table supplies for ranch hands scraped by barbed wire, she panicked. Her whisper trembled like glass, "I'm not clean." He looked at her, puzzled, not prying. Instead of questions or judgment, he only said, "Eat first, rest after. The rest can wait." It had been so long since anyone let her be more than her scars. For the first time in years, she wondered if waiting here at this quiet ranch might mean more than survival. It might mean the beginning of something she no longer dared name. That night, Clara kept the cloth tied tight, even as she drifted near the fire. But dawn always has its way of uncovering shadows. What would happen when Thomas began to truly see her? The prairie dawn crept slowly, pink and pale, across the horizon, filtering through the thin curtains of the cabin. Clara stirred awake on the hard cot by the hearth, her cloth still wound tightly around her head. Sleep had not softened her. It had only made her more aware of the weight she carried. She had dreamed of whispers, the same ones from her family, not clean, not worthy, not wanted. The smell of frying bacon startled her back to the present. She sat up, blinking. At the stove stood Thomas, moving with quiet ease as though he had been doing it his whole life. His broad back bent slightly as he turned the skillet. When he noticed her, he gave a small nod, not forcing a smile, not demanding thanks. "Coffee's on the table," he said simply. Clara hesitated before rising. She moved carefully, making sure her cloth remained in place. Every motion was deliberate. She had learned to live hidden, and old habits cling like burrs. She took the coffee cup in both hands, letting its warmth seep into her fingers. "You can sit," Thomas said after a moment, setting the food down. He took his own chair, not across from her, but beside angled so she wouldn't feel cornered. For a while, the only sound was the scrape of forks against tin plates. Finally, he spoke. "You got a name?" Clara's breath caught. It had been so long since anyone asked. "Clara," she whispered. "Clara," he repeated, like trying it on his tongue. "Name suits you." She didn't answer, only lowered her gaze, but inside something shifted, small, fragile but real. After breakfast, Thomas led her outside. The ranch spread wide before them, weathered fences, cattle grazing in the distance, the barn leaning stubbornly against the prairie winds. "Plenty of work," he said. "Chickens need tending. Bread needs baking. And—" he paused, his voice softening. "You don't have to talk much if you'd rather not. Silence isn't a flaw here." Clara followed him to the chicken coop, her carpet bag still by the hearth, untouched. As she scattered grain, she felt the birds rush around her feet. Their clucking and fluttering filled the silence, covering what she couldn't say. For the next days, this became their rhythm. She cooked, cleaned, tended small things. He worked the land-fixed fences and returned with dust in his hair and gratitude in his eyes. He didn't pry, didn't ask why she always kept the cloth tied tight. Yet Clara felt it growing, the moment when truth would no longer stay hidden. Because every dawn revealed a little more, how his gaze lingered, not out of pity, but respect, how his silence carried no judgment, how her hands, once trembling, steadied when working beside him. Still, her fear clung. She remembered the voices, the branding of shame that lived not only on her skin, but deep inside her spirit. She feared the moment his eyes would change, like all the others when cloth gave way to scars. One evening, as she set bread on the table, Thomas studied her more closely than before. "You don't have to keep hiding, Clara," he said gently. "Not from me." Her breath hitched, and she clutched the edge of the table. The cloth suddenly felt heavy as chains. She shook her head. "You don't understand." He didn't push. He only nodded, his voice quiet. "When you're ready." That night, Clara sat awake by the fire long after he had gone to bed. Her fingers traced the knot of the cloth again and again. She had come here to survive, but perhaps, just perhaps, she was being given a chance to live. At dawn, Clara knew the choice could not be delayed forever. The cloth that bound her had once protected her, but now it threatened to suffocate the very hope she had begun to feel. What would happen the day she let it fall? The days fell into rhythm like the steady ticking of a clock in a quiet room. Clara rose early, kneading bread until her hands grew strong, again feeding chickens and stirring pots of stew that filled the cabin with warmth. Thomas worked the land, his one-horse plow cutting into stubborn earth, his broad shoulders stooped but unbroken. At night, they shared meals at the wooden table. His words were few, her words fewer, but silence between them began to feel less like emptiness and more like company. Still, the cloth remained. Every evening, as the light slipped away, Clara would tug it tighter, ensuring no glimpse of what lay beneath could betray her. Beneath it were not only scars, but the memory of hands that had forced voices that had branded her as unclean. The cloth was her prison, but also her shield. Thomas never pushed, and yet Clara felt his gaze, not the harsh scrutiny she'd known all her life, but something gentler, like a man waiting for rain he could not summon. One afternoon, a storm rolled in. The sky turned iron, wind rattled the shutters, and rain lashed against the cabin walls. Thomas returned from the barn soaked through his shirt, clinging, his hair plastered to his forehead. Clara hurried to fetch a blanket, pressing it into his arms. "Sit," she whispered. "You'll catch cold." He obeyed without question, but when his hands brushed hers, she froze. Her cloth slipped slightly at the edge of her jaw. For the briefest second, pale scar tissue caught the light. Thomas's eyes flicked, then held still. He did not flinch. He did not look away. His voice was quiet, steady. "Clara." She jerked back, fumbling to fix the cloth, her chest tightening with panic. "Please," she begged, her voice breaking. "Don't look at me." The words hung heavy in the air, louder than the storm outside. Thomas didn't move closer, nor did he reach for her. He simply spoke as if laying down a truth. "I wasn't looking at scars. I was looking at you." Clara's throat closed. She wanted to believe him, but decades of cruelty had written other truths into her bones. She shook her head, tears burning. "You don't know what's under here. If you did, you'd freeze like the rest." Thomas leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his voice as gentle as a prayer. "Maybe I already froze, Clara. The first day I saw you standing at that station wrapped up like the world had no place for you. Something in me stopped then, not because I saw shame, because I saw someone still standing when most would have fallen. Her tears spilled hot and unrelenting. She turned away clutching at the cloth as though it were the last thread holding her together. Yet his words pierced, planting a seed she could not shake. That night, long after Thomas had gone to bed, Clara stared at her reflection in the small shard of mirror above the wash basin. She pulled the cloth back just enough to see the jagged lines across her cheek. They were not beautiful. But for the first time, she wondered, were they truly as damning as she had believed, or were they proof she had survived what others could not? The storm outside eased, but within Clara, a storm of another kind raged, fear colliding with the faintest glimmer of hope. By dawn, the decision pressed heavy on Clara's chest. She could keep the cloth and remain hidden forever, or she could risk everything and let Thomas see her fully. Would love survive the unveiling? The storm had left the earth damp and shining, the air fresh with the scent of sage and wet soil. But inside Clara, the storm had only shifted, not passed. For days she carried Thomas's words with her. I wasn't looking at scars. I was looking at you. They circled in her chest, fragile as glass, daring her to believe what she had long dismissed. The cloth remained tied. Yet each time Thomas entered the room, every time his boots pressed across the wooden floor, she felt the fabric's weight like shackles around her throat. On the fifth evening after the storm, Clara lingered by the hearth. She had baked bread, the crust golden and crisp, and set it on the table. Thomas washed his hands at the basin's shoulders, weary from mending fence posts. Silence hummed between them, not cold but restless like the air before lightning. At last Clara spoke, her voice barely a thread. Thomas. He turned. Yes, her fingers gripped the edge of the cloth. Her heart thundered. She had told herself she was only a cook here, a pair of hands, nothing more. But his kindness, his steadiness, he had cracked that shell. Slowly, painfully, she loosened the knot. The cloth slid away, falling to her lap. The scars were there in full. Faint welts traced her jawline. Burn marks, uneven and cruel, marred the soft curve of her cheek. They were remnants of a life she had not chosen, of a husband's rage, of in-laws who spat words sharper than whips. For years she had carried the lie that she was unclean. Clara closed her eyes, bracing for the sound she knew so well, the gasp, the recoil, the silence filled with shame. But it never came. Instead, she heard the scrape of a chair, and then his voice, low and trembling, not with horror, but with something closer to reverence. Lord! Her eyes flew open. Thomas was sitting across from her, his rough hands resting on the table. He did not flinch. His gaze held steady, strong enough that it stole her breath. You've carried this, he said softly, all alone. Tears stung her eyes. I told you. I'm not clean. Thomas shook his head. No, Clara. You're not unclean. You're alive. You're standing here feeding me bread, keeping this place warm. Those scars, they don't mark shame. They mark survival. The words struck deep. She wanted to look away, but his eyes anchored her. Her lip quivered. Men before you. They looked and turned, even family. They said I was ruined. His voice hardened, not at her, but for her. Then they were blind, Clara. Blind to the woman in front of them. Blind to the strength God saw fit to keep breathing when others would have given up. Her tears slipped free, falling hot against her scarred cheek. And then Thomas did the unthinkable. Slowly, carefully, as if she might break, he reached across the table and placed his calloused hand over hers. The touch was warm, solid, no recoil, no hesitation. Her heart cracked open, a flood of years, rushing out, years of hiding, of shame, of silence. She trembled, but for the first time in decades, she did not pull away. You see me, she whispered. I always did, he said simply. The room fell quiet. Outside, the wind rustled the prairie grass. Inside, something else stirred, something tender, something steady. For Clara, it was as though the cabin walls themselves had shifted, no longer confining, but sheltering. That night, she didn't tie the cloth again. She set it neatly in her carpet bag and left it there. Her scars were not gone, but for the first time, they no longer chained her. Clara had taken the greatest risk of her life, showing her scars, and Thomas had not turned away. But in towns like Sagebrush Bend, whispers travel fast. What would happen when others saw her and judged her as harshly as before? Would Thomas still stand at her side? For a time, Clara felt as though she had stepped into another life. Each morning she woke to the smell of coffee Thomas brewed before heading out to the pastures. Each evening they shared bread and stew, sometimes in silence, sometimes with his quiet stories of the land. And every night the cloth stayed folded in her bag, not across her face. But peace in the West was always fragile. It began with a trip into town. Clara had insisted on going with Thomas to Sagebrush Bend for supplies. "I won't hide anymore," she told him, her voice trembling but resolute. He only nodded, pride flickering in his eyes. The town bustled with wagons, cattlemen and women carrying baskets. As Clara stepped down from the wagon, whispers rose like weeds. A woman nudged her companion, murmuring behind a gloved hand. A ranch hand stopped mid-laugh, his eyes fixed, his smile curdling. "Lord, look at her face," someone hissed. "She ought to cover up. No wonder no man wanted her." The words sliced sharper than any blade. Clara's chest burned, and for a moment her hand twitched toward the bag where the cloth still lay folded. Old instinct screamed, "Hide. Protect yourself. Pretend you are less." But then Thomas's hand touched her elbow, firm and steady. "Walk tall," he said softly. So she did. Together they went about their errands, buying flour salt nails for the barn. But everywhere she turned, Clara felt the eyes, the judgment, the cruel amusement of people who could not see past her scars. At the mercantile, Mrs. Fletcher, the shopkeeper's wife, sniffed openly. "Well, Thomas Hale," she said with false sweetness, "never thought I'd see the day you'd bring her here." Her gaze darted like a knife to Clara's face. Thomas's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said evenly, "she has a name. Clara, and she's with me." The woman flushed but did not apologize. Clara's hands trembled as she placed sugar on the counter. All the old shame threatened to drown her. When they finally left the store, she could barely hold back tears. On the wagon ride home, silence stretched. Clara finally whispered, "You saw how they looked at me. How they always will. Maybe I don't belong here either." Thomas pulled the reins, bringing the wagon to a slow halt. Dust rose around them, swirling in the sunlight. He turned to her, his face stern but his voice gentle. "Clara, I don't give a damn how they look. I saw a woman strong enough to walk into that town without her veil. That's the only thing I'll remember." Her throat tightened. "But the shame is not yours," he cut in. "It never was." The words settled deep like seeds waiting for rain. When they reached the homestead, Clara stepped down from the wagon and, instead of retreating inside, stood in the open yard. She closed her eyes, letting the prairie wind brush across her scars. It was not pity she felt, it was the raw sting of freedom, but freedom was not without its cost. That night, as Thomas stacked wood by the hearth, a knock rattled the cabin door. Clara froze. Thomas opened it to find two men from town, ranch hands she vaguely recognized. Thomas one said, his eyes darting toward Clara, a word of advice. "You ought not flaunt her in town. Folks don't like surprises." Thomas's eyes narrowed. "She's not a surprise. She's my partner." The men chuckled, cruel and low. "Partner. She's a charity case." Thomas stepped forward, the firelight sharpening his features. "Then you best leave before charity runs out." The men muttered curses and left, boots crunching in the dirt. Clara stood trembling by the table, tears brimming. "Thomas," she whispered, "why do you keep defending me? Don't you see I'm a burden? An embarrassment?" He turned to her, crossing the room with steady strides. Taking her scarred face gently in his rough hands, he said, "Clara, listen to me. You are not a burden. You are the strongest woman I've ever known. And if this town can't see that, then to hell with the town. I see you, and I choose you." Her breath caught. No man had ever spoken such words to her, not without cruelty hiding beneath. In that moment, something long buried within her stirred. Perhaps she could believe him. Perhaps she could belong. The whispers of Sagebrush Bend would not die easily. Clara had shed her cloth, but the world still tested her resolve. Would she have the courage to stand openly, scars and all, when the past came knocking at her door once more? The next morning dawned gold across the plains, but Clara's heart was heavy. Though Thomas's words had steadied her, The memory of the townsfolk's whispers still clung like dust she couldn't shake. She moved about the cabin quietly, kneading bread, sweeping the hearth, feeding the hens. It was the rhythm of survival, but her thoughts twisted restlessly. How long before even Thomas tires of defending me? How long before the past finds me again? She did not have to wait long. By midday, a rider appeared on the horizon. Dust rose behind him in a steady trail. Clara squinted through the window, her stomach turning. Thomas, splitting wood by the barn, wiped his brow and straightened. The horse slowed as it neared. The rider dismounted, a man with a hard face, one Clara knew too well. Her breath left her body. It was Jonah Black. Once her brother-in-law, now her tormentor's shadow made flesh. He had laughed when her husband struck her, called her tainted, whispered that she should hide her face forever. He had been there, the night flames licked her cheek when shame became scar. Clara, Jonah drawled, tugging off his gloves as though arriving at his own table. I heard tell you'd fetched up here. Imagine my surprise. Clara's knees weakened, but she gripped the windowsill, forcing herself upright. Thomas stepped between them, calm but solid as an oak. You've no business here, Thomas said evenly. Jonah smirked. Family's always got business. I've come for what's mine. His eyes flicked toward Clara, sharp and cruel. She was married to my brother. That makes her our shame to carry. Clara gasped. Shame. That word again, heavy as chains. She wanted to shrink back to cover her face, but Thomas's hand brushed against hers, anchoring her. No, Thomas said firmly. She is not yours, not your brother's, not your family's. She's her own, and she's with me now. Jonah laughed, but there was no humor in it. With you, look at her, scarred, broken, worthless. A woman like her can't start over. She can't belong anywhere. Clara's heart pounded. For years she had believed those words. For years she had let them cage her. But now, standing in Thomas's shadow, she felt a flicker of something else, a spark. Her voice trembled, but it came. You're wrong, Jonah. I do belong. Maybe not to you, not to those who shamed me. But here, with Thomas, with this land, with the quiet and the work, I belong. The air shifted. Thomas's eyes shone fierce and proud. Jonah sneered, stepping closer. You'll regret saying that. His hand twitched toward the knife at his belt. In an instant, Thomas moved. He planted himself squarely before Clara, his voice low but iron-strong. Leave, now, or you'll find out how a one-armed man defends what's his. Jonah's smirk faltered. His eyes flickered between Clara's unflinching gaze and Thomas's unyielding stance. For a long moment, silence stretched, broken only by the cry of a hawk circling above. Finally, Jonah spat in the dirt. Keep her then, but don't say I didn't warn you. Some scars never heal. He swung onto his horse and rode off, dust swallowing him whole. When the sound faded, Clara sank onto the porch steps, trembling. Thomas knelt beside her, his single hand closing over hers. You were brave, he whispered. She shook her head. I thought I'd fall apart, but you didn't. You stood. Clara, he lifted her chin gently, his eyes locking onto hers. You're stronger than even you know. Her tears spilled, but they were not only of fear. They carried something lighter, release long denied. For the first time, she had faced her past without hiding. For the first time, she had spoken her truth aloud. And though her body still shook, her spirit stood taller. Jonah's departure left more than dust behind it, left questions. Could Clara truly build a future when her scars still burned in memory? Would the town ever see her as more than damaged? And what role would Thomas play as her partner in both struggle and healing? The days after Jonah's visit carried a different weight. Though Clara's heart still skipped at the thought of him returning, there was also a newfound stillness, like the prairie after a storm, when the air smells of wet earth and second chances. Clara woke early each morning, not out of fear, but from a strange, tender eagerness. She tied her apron, kneaded bread, and set the kettle to boil. Outside, Thomas's steady steps marked the rhythm of their life-splitting logs, feeding stock, mending fence, with a quiet patience that matched her own. One afternoon, as Clara hung laundry on the line, a pair of neighbor children wandered up the path, two little girls in sun-faded dresses, barefoot and wide-eyed. Their mother had sent them with eggs to trade. Clara knelt to thank them, her scarred cheek catching the light. She expected the flinch, the whispers. Instead, one of the girls studied her face thoughtfully before blurting, "You smile like my mama used to." Clara froze, then laughed softly, a sound she hadn't heard from herself in years. She reached out, tucking a stray curl behind the child's ear. "And you're just as bold as I was at your age," she said. The girls giggled, darting away down the lane. Thomas, watching from the porch, grinned. "You see," he said when Clara came back. "Children know better than grown folk. They see hearts before they see scars." That evening after supper, they sat together on the porch. The horizon blazed with sunset copper and lavender bleeding into one another. Clara leaned against the railing, her hands folded loosely in her lap. "Thomas," she began hesitantly, "do you ever think, maybe I've taken too much space in your life, too much of your strength?" He turned to her, his gaze steady as the hills. "Clara, you haven't taken anything. You've given me back what I thought I'd lost: quiet company, the kind that makes a man feel whole. You think scars make you less, but to me they're proof that you've lived, that you've survived. And he stopped, swallowing the emotion that caught in his throat. "I'm grateful you stayed." Her eyes brimmed. For so long she had carried the weight of not being enough. Yet here was a man who asked for nothing but her presence. That night she left the cloth folded on the table. She would not wear it again. Weeks passed and Sagebrush Bend began to shift in small, almost imperceptible ways. Some still whispered, but others began to nod as Clara walked past. Mrs. Fletcher, the same woman who had sneered at her, brought over a jar of preserves with a stiff apology. The mercantile keeper started asking her opinion on fabric bolts, and the neighbor children, bold as colts, began to drop by for stories curling against her skirts as she read aloud by lamplight. Clara was no longer the woman who shrank into corners. She had become part of the rhythm of the land, its work, its laughter, its healing silences. One evening after putting the kettle on, Clara stepped outside and found Thomas mending a gate. She walked to him, resting her hand gently on his shoulder. "Thomas," she said softly, "I don't know what tomorrow will bring, but if you'll have me, I'd like to face it with you. As your wife." His hammer stilled. Slowly he turned, eyes bright with something between wonder and relief. "Clara, I was waiting for you to ask," he said with a smile that deepened the lines around his eyes. The prairie wind carried their laughter into the dusk. That night, as stars blinked awake overhead, Clara stood at the threshold of the cabin, Thomas's hand warm in hers. She whispered a prayer of thanks, not for perfection, but for belonging. Not for a life without scars, but for love that saw beyond them. And for the first time in 50 years, she felt truly home. Out on the wide prairie, Clara no longer hid behind a cloth. The scars that once carried shame had become a map of her survival. And when Thomas looked at her, he didn't see what the world had called unclean. He saw courage. He saw a woman who endured storms and still chose kindness. That's the heart of this story. Life may carve deep marks into us, but those marks can also be proof that we have lived, endured, and are still here. Healing doesn't always arrive in a sudden miracle. It often comes in small, steady moments: a hand that doesn't let go, a voice that speaks gently, a glance that says, "You matter to me." Friends, maybe that's something we can take into our own lives. No matter how late the hour or how heavy the years, it's never too late for someone to look at you and see not your scars, but your worth. If this story touched you, I warmly invite you to subscribe to None, Wild West Saga. Share it with someone who might need a reminder that second chances still exist. And tell us in the comments, would you like to see what comes next for Clara and Thomas? Or hear more stories of quiet strength, late blooming love, and the healing power of dignity? Because sometimes a second chapter is the most beautiful of all,